Our meeting today, our discussions are going to focus on three quite distinct, but also, again, very commonplace forms of illiberal influence: information operations, foreign finance of political parties and campaigns, and undisclosed or hidden public debt. And while the intentions behind each type of tactic or the impacts of these three forms of illiberal influence can vary, there is one consistent through line that they all share, and that's opacity. Illiberal actors take pains to hide their influence operations, again, to varying degrees, but there is always this element of a lack of transparency, because they know these tactics run counter to the rule of law and that exposure can delegitimize their playbook and risk repudiation from the general public and democratic community. So with this in mind, really, I'm so excited that we're joined today and, in this longer term endeavor by the Open Government Partnership, because their role, their participation is so critical. When OGP was founded 10 years ago, these illiberal operations were not as present in the governance landscape, but today their increasing frequency and scope make it essential that the openness community can explore opportunities for developing new types of transparency commitments that are effective in addressing this threat. And then at the same time, within the governance landscape, legislatures who are responsible for setting the regulatory environment and conducting oversight have also an essential role to play in supporting transparency to build democratic resilience. So we're here this morning connecting some dots, honing in on this nexus of legislatures, transparency, and democratic resilience. And we hope that the presentations, the breakout discussion, the interaction, the networking, all of it today will help us to collectively identify policy measures and potential commitments for OGP action plans to understand in what context transparency is an effective measure and an oversight as well, an effective measure against foreign illiberal influences. And results from the discussions today also, I'll mention, are going to be captured in a series of joint NDI OGP policy briefs that we'll share with all of you in the coming weeks as well. So I just like to conclude by thanking everyone for joining us today, and really thanking you in advance for what I'm sure is going to be some very lively discussion, participation, and contributions during the sessions this morning. So I'll hand it over to back to Victoria.
Thanks, Kristen, and I will hand it over to Joe.
Thanks, Victoria. Thanks, Kristen. Thanks to the whole NDI team and to our extra presenters today, to our discussion group hosts, and most importantly, thank you to those of you working around the world to push tirelessly for these reforms. This discussion couldn't be more timely, as Kristen has said, and it's not something that, the bad news, I guess, is that it's not something that is going to happen if we don't keep working on it in a lot of places. 10 years ago, OGP's founders knew that democracy needed to be defended, consolidated, strengthened. They thought that an open government approach was essential, but that it also was a way of talking about human rights and democracy without sometimes using those words. 10 years later, we know that we need to look the problem squarely in the eye. I do not think, however, that any of us who were around this community 10 years ago really understood where we would arrive now, a decade later. So the good news is, and I'll talk much more about this, but I really want to hear from our experts, that we have many of the tools and many of the solutions and approaches to begin turning these troubling trends around. The question, I think, and the challenge for all of us at the end of the day, especially when we think about legislatures, is can we get these right ideas in the right hands? And will they collectively muster the will to turn back the tide? So I'm looking forward to talking about these problems, the tools legislatures can use, and the steps they can take around the world. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you on your ideas. So thank you for attending. Victoria?
Thanks, Joe. So we will now transition to our first session. And our first session, Patterns on Foreign Illiberal Influence Operations, we're joined by three experts who will provide an overview of the trends, indicators, and policy measures that signify the threat of illiberal influence operations from 3 different global contexts. So Jessica Brandt, who's joining us from Brookings, will speak on information operations. Next, Bradley Mern from Paragon International University on opaque debt, and Joshua Rudolph from USAID on foreign funding of political parties. And then after this, we will have a short break, and then we will be divvied up into our self-selected breakout rooms where we can discuss the topics more in depth. So for our first presentation, Jessica, over to you.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me with you guys this morning. It's a treat to be with you and with fellow panelists. So I was asked to say a few words about the nature of the challenge and how I think the transparency agenda can be leveraged to good effect. So let me start with the challenge. I think it'll be no surprise to this group that Russia and China both seek to advance their interests in the information domain, and they do so deliberately spreading or amplifying information that's false or misleading. Russia in particular frequently engages in deceptive practices such as misrepresenting the origin of content or its intent, and both invest large sums in propaganda networks that proliferate their preferred and I would say distorted narratives. In order to draw false equivalence with their own illiberal systems, both deploy whataboutism to paint democratic governments as hypocritical, particularly on visible social issues, including race. Both have spread multiple and at times conflicting conspiracy theories to deflect criticism of their own misdeeds and to erode the idea that there is such a thing as objective truth. Moscow in particular deploys a network of proxy influencers to churn up anti-Western sentiment, while Beijing has worked to control digital distribution channels in the Chinese-speaking world and to co-opt independent media abroad. And both want to cast democratic systems as weak and ineffective, making them less appealing to would-be activists at home. And for Russia, this is a way to drive polarization up and I think trust in institutions down, where for China, it's a way to highlight the strengths of its own alternative economic and political model. But both put liberal institutions, including legislatures and their members, in their crosshairs, and both want to weaken liberal norms that constrain their activities, making the world safe for their brand of autocratic governance. So for Putin and Xi, the goal of these pursuits is to maintain a grip on power at home and to weaken democratic competitors abroad. Why do they do this? Why this approach? I think Russia and China pursue this approach because they understand that even as open information spaces confer important strategic advantages to democracies over the long run, they create vulnerabilities for them in the short term. Because free societies where academics and journalists and civil society experts like this group are connected to counterparts across the world, they can be easily disrupted using low-cost deniable tools. And while democracy depends on the idea that the truth is knowable and that citizens can discern it and they can use it, to govern themselves, authoritarians have no such need for a healthy information space to thrive, which means they can pollute the information environment without great concern for eroding the strength of their own institutions. And in fact, I would say it's quite the opposite, that autocrats are actually vulnerable to the free flow of information that might expose their failures or false promises. And they benefit from widespread public skepticism that the truth exists at all. So what does this mean concretely for legislatures and their members? I would say 3 things. 1, that they're a target of multiple long-running campaigns to denigrate them and to make them appear weak and ineffective. That individual members could be targets for hack and leak operations designed to discredit them and diminish trust in elected leaders or in electoral processes, more broadly. And that while in office, they're challenged to govern societies that are increasingly polarized and distrustful. So what to do? Let me first say a word about the broad approach. I think we should not be reactive. We should remember that Russia and China choose this terrain intentionally because it provides them certain advantages, and that liberal democratic governments need to respond on their own terms in the places that are most conducive to their success and in ways that are concordant with their values because those values are strengths. I think that could include advancing measures to support internet freedom worldwide, mostly because it's the right thing to do, but also because it puts autocrats on the back foot. Also supporting independent media because independent media speak truth to power and they, keep citizens informed. I'm often asked how legislatures should think about regulating social media platforms. And I think the #1 goal should be to make transparency the norm. The liberal democratic approach to technology governance should be rooted in transparency and accountability, which is in contrast to the authoritarian approaches that are rooted in censorship and surveillance. So for example, to facilitate third-party auditing of content moderation practices and of algorithmic systems that curate information, lawmakers should advance measures that would improve platform transparency. And I think a good model is the Platform Transparency and Accountability Act that's proposed here in the United States. It would enable qualified academic researchers to access platform data, and it would shield researchers from criminal and civil liability when they scrape publicly available websites to conduct analysis in the public interest. And I hope it's a model that will be adopted here. I also think, like, as we go forward, lawmakers around the world should be conducting dialogue with European and UK counterparts who have, very recent experience advancing regulatory frameworks for platform transparency. Because again, I think one of the most important advantages that liberal societies have is their relationships. They're a very powerful and vibrant network of relationships with one another for sharing good practice and lessons learned. Maybe just one caveat that I would offer is that, I think it's important, to think about the fact that democracies need to be mindful that the regulations that they adopt at home can be used to justify policies that infringe on digital rights elsewhere. I'm thinking, for example, of like NetsDG, which obligated social media platforms with a certain threshold of users to remove clearly illegal content within 24 hours and all illegal content within 7 days, or face very stiff penalties. And I think what this law did was create incentives for, for folks to err on the side of taking borderline content down, and therefore had a chilling effect on speech. But more importantly, or at least as importantly, it led to the proliferation of copycat laws in far less free places. So Turkey, for example, which are being used, to repressive ends. And this obviously should not forestall democratic governments from taking action at all or for enacting regulation entirely. It just means democracies need to be thoughtful in their approaches and plan ahead to ensure that they don't give autocrats talking points. Maybe just a few recent examples. I mean, that's why I was quite concerned when Facebook blocked links to Russian state media, maybe now 2 weeks ago at the request of European governments. There was very little transparency about which governments made exactly which requests. We know a little bit more about those requests now, but not nearly enough. And I think it poses a precedent problem because many other governments in many other contexts will ask for content to be taken, many other forms of content to be taken down, that they believe is anathema to their political or social interests. And there's obviously a very big difference between these requests coming from democratic governments and from autocratic ones, but there are many, many governments that fall somewhere in between. So this is an example where I think, sort of bearing precedent in mind really matters. It's also a reason why I worry about the administration's Alliance for the Future of the Internet, which, to the extent we know very much about it, argues for sort of a new coherent vision for the internet. And I think this framing is problematic because Russia and China actively argue that what we need is a new framing. And so I just think rather than casting this effort as an attempt to build new norms or establish new norms, it'd be much more productive to sort of ground the initiative firmly in existing ones like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? Things that have the sort of force of international law. And you could frame the initiative as, an effort to generate new commitments that are much needed towards making good on existing principles. Because I think that would help not, avoid boosting Russia and China's own arguments in favor of new approaches. So I think there are just lessons there for other governments in other contexts to how we can be mindful of proceeding towards sensible regulation in the public interest that also is thoughtful about precedent going forward. So anyway, I'll just leave it there, but I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts and questions and to hearing the presentations from other speakers. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And next we have Bradley Murr from Paragon International University to speak on opaque debt.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and good evening from Phnom Penh. I'll try to structure this in a way that, as it's a topic that some folks are desperately passionate about, and others, when they hear the word debt, their eyes somewhat glaze over. But structure it generally before moving into looking at the question of China in particular, and then potential legislative options to move forward. Ultimately, when we think about debt, when we think about sovereign debt, most people go back to thinking about what we call the Paris Club. Going back to 1956, the entity that essentially exists to renegotiate debt. We think of debt as debt from multilateral entities like the World Bank or the IMF. We think state-to-state lending, and we think about debt crises in the 1980s and the 1990s, the highly indebted poor countries initiative, which was reasonably successful. And that's a completely different world of debt to that which we're confronting today. The global debt landscape has fundamentally changed. And illiberal actors, particularly China, but others as well, have taken advantage of that change in landscape. But before we can understand what's sort of going on the Chinese side and on other illiberal regime side, it's really vital to look at how that landscape has changed specifically. At this point in time, the vast majority of debt to low-income countries, to less developed economies, is not to traditional lenders, not to the traditional liberal democracies in the West, as well as the usual multilaterals. Rather, for the last 7 or 8 years, the majority of that lending has come from other sources. Sometimes it's simply commercial banks, but a very, very, very large share, increasingly the plurality share, comes from China, and from other states. Now, this is a big issue for a number of reasons. The first is that the change in the source means that renegotiation of debt when it becomes unaffordable to pay or to maintain payments is simply not possible. Many of these agreements between various regimes and their debtor states have intentional confidentiality clauses, and simply China or other states will refuse to renegotiate the debt. They'll basically go on and take assets that have been promised in the event of default. At the same time, when we look at this enormous shift of how global lending occurs, we also have to look at the fact that we see not just changes in how debt is issued, but we also are observing changes specifically in the fiscal picture for less developed countries, which in the next few years, and already we're starting to see this in countries such as Laos and Zambia, which I'll talk about later, where they are incredibly vulnerable. Looking at their growth and overall debt. We see a tripling of less developed country debt simply over the past decade. Median public debt in LDCs rose from 35 to 50% GDP just over the last decade. And now we're looking at balance sheets that are exacerbated with problems because of COVID. The vast majority of countries took out debt to basically deal with this, this problem, putting them in a much less beneficial position to be able to pay it off. At the same time, we see new types of debt. We see contingent liabilities. In other words, where the state is liable for debt taken on by other entities that we would traditionally not think of. Subnational entities, state-owned enterprises, et cetera, which can be and has shown to be an enormous shock to ministries of finance, to central banks even, but especially to other creditors, wondering, okay, how do you happen to owe $200 million that we never saw? And over the course of the last few years, we've seen an enormous change in the level of off-book debt, of opaque debt. Just for this year, for 2020, in the 2022 World Bank statistics, there's an added $200 billion in debt that we simply did not know about a year ago. It's not new debt, it's simply debt that wasn't reported. And this is, we don't know how big the iceberg is, which is one of the reasons this is so incredibly terrifying. At the same time, we see governments that have overall across the board, a general rise in debt service obligations. But with opaque debt, the problem really becomes if you get into trouble, no one really wants to restructure. No one wants to deal with you. On the one hand, you might have a lender like China that explicitly has clauses of it will determine whether or not wants to restructure, and that's all you have. On the other creditors simply don't buy it. They wonder what else is there, what else is going on, and they want to get out as quickly as possible and simply want to get paid. So you see enormous blocks in trust and a serious undermining of the ability of states to renegotiate over time that puts them in immense problems, essentially. The focus on China really came out of a paper a few years ago, or not even a few years ago, by China Aid Data, falling into this very enormous debate on the Belt and Road Initiative. And the China Aid Data figures showed $385 billion of debt that previously was not well known, that was essentially off the books or hidden, that China had lent to members of the BRI initiative. And we see, I think the first example of this was Zambia in 2020, where Zambia essentially was unable to pay its debts, was unable to basically keep up, et cetera, and was running rapidly towards default. And other creditors simply said, okay, we're not even going to begin to touch this because we don't know how much money you owe to China. We know it's a lot, but we're not going to renegotiate until you deal with that. And of course, Zambia didn't. Zambia eventually lost its airport, and we saw significant problems. Laos. Just 2 or 3 years ago, I recall sitting on a panel and debating whether there was such a thing as a debt trap, and the representative from China very strongly denying that Laos had a problem. And of course, we have a $6 billion railway now from Kunming to Vientiane that has racked up hundreds of millions of dollars in opaque debt. And just last year, the government of Laos stated, we can't pay it. We're never going to be able to pay it. We're not going to be able to pay it off at all by 2030. We're not even going to be able to probably meet our commitments for $1 billion a year in debt servicing just from 2022 to 2025. For a country like Laos that has a veto vote in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, like all members, that gives China an enormous amount of leverage in terms of its own issues in the South China Sea and not having to rely on its usual allies. At the same time, because China's debt comes primarily out of the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank, it's not necessarily official debt. And thus, again, it's subject to different rules for renegotiation. Now, the question of how one deals with this, does one have to explicitly look at it and say, well, this is a question of debt trap from BRI and wade into this huge debate? I would say for folks in legislatures, probably not. It's, I think, a much more effective approach to focus around the sheer economic fundamentals of the problem and to avoid getting trapped in what has been a lengthy multi-year debate among academics and also brings in other parties and other interest groups that do have an insight there and really just confront the issue because of the simple reality of where we're going with it and the likelihood that we'll see significant problems in the short term. By short term, I really mean 2 to 3 years, essentially. At this point, the reality is that the COVID-19 G20 debt service suspension is coming to an end, or it basically has ended. That's $650 billion in extra IMF support that's no longer going to be there. We're going to be seeing rising interest rates. We're looking at the probability of fresh weaknesses in exports, and we're also looking at the potential for contagion from the very much expected Russian debt default that should be coming anytime soon, if everyone's predictions are fundamentally correct. This overall deteriorating fiscal picture places governments in a position where trying to clean up or get its fiscal house in order becomes incredibly important. Specifically, taking proactive first steps to make clear to lenders, to all lenders, that governments are working to be as transparent as possible in terms of what their actual debt is. It could be too late in certain cases in certain states, as we saw with Laos, to clean everything off the books. But by basically saying, yes, here's an actual, here is a realistic picture of our current debt situation. Here is how severe it is. It's possible to begin to rebuild trust with creditors and to begin to alter the overall fiscal picture for a country. In terms of what that looks like, World Bank last year came out with, and it's still really acting as the focal point document, sort of the main study on debt in developing countries, highlighting many of these issues, and proposes a relatively thorough public debt management legal framework, which has really become and been taken up across the board as, okay, this is something of at least a model that can be utilized, not in all cases with country-specific institutional transport, but it can be essential. I just want to highlight 4 of those aspects. The first is developing a legal structure that clarifies borrowing authority and debt authorization. Who actually has the authority to take out debt? And this is, in many cases, incredibly unclear in large numbers of countries. Second, and I think this is the most important, I probably should put it first, defining public debt according to international standards. That it goes beyond areas that we think of more traditionally, and we look into what are SOE, state-owned enterprise obligations, what are contingent liabilities, what other special drawing rights, what subnational debt exists. And once debt is reconceptualized and the legal framework includes all of that, it becomes much more tractable to begin to actually analyze and to come up with a more thorough picture. 3, clear regulatory framework for debt disclosure statistics, which does not exist in most in most less developed countries, as well as including public debt and audit requirements. As to where things can move forward for next steps, in my view, just as the United Nations has really pushed the Sustainable Development Goals as a focal point for coordination and collaboration on broader questions of development, the G20's Common Framework for Debt Treatments, which was launched a little over a year ago, is something of a global focal point, and unfortunately has moved relatively slowly. And there's a very significant amount of discussion of, well, the pressure here should be on IMF and World Bank, but there is a very strong domestic role to play as well. And that really goes to the change in domestic regulations and utilizing legislative oversight authority to begin to push central banks and others to begin to make debt relatively much clearer than it has been at this point. In terms of long-term changes, if we're looking at how to basically avoid this problem in the future, one of the key areas is really local capital market development, is countries being able to wean themselves off of foreign lending and being able to lend domestically. Now, obviously, local capital market development is an incredibly difficult process and takes time, but building out the legal framework for that and developing it is remarkably successful in the long term, not just in terms of creating the local debt market itself, but enormously expanding the set of local stakeholders who now have an interest in basically seeing what is the real fiscal picture of the country. Local banks, local investors, et cetera, now really need this, and you get more allies than simply presenting it as, oh, well, this is a problem. So it's a chance to really go ahead and build more coalitions. The third point I would emphasize is the possibility of introducing legislation that makes clear that new debt taken on that does not adhere to revised reporting requirements is essentially treated as subsidiary debt. In other words, when it comes to prioritizing who's paid off and who gets paid off first, debt that's not disclosed goes to the bottom of the pile. It basically says, okay, yeah, we might owe you 300. So-and-so signed off on 300 million, but this was never publicly disclosed under our legislation because you didn't disclose it. If we default, if we have to go into renegotiation, whatever, we're simply going to pay you last. Any future debt we take out will come over before this because the rules were simply not followed. And it's that sort of legal framework that really needs to be developed. And it is, and again, I do strongly recommend looking at what G20's recommended, as well as the World Bank framework for developing an operational public debt management legal framework. I apologize, I know I've gone over a little bit of time, so let me stop there. I very much look forward to the discussion in the breakout rooms, and thank you so much.
No problem, Brad. Thank you so much. That was great. And I also just wanted to make a quick announcement that we will have a couple minutes at the end of this session for a couple of questions if folks have them. So while the discussions, the breakout sessions are really for us to be hearing and learning from you all, especially if anyone has any pressing questions at this time for the speakers, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can get to them at the end. And so thirdly, we have Josh Rudolph from USAID, who is going to speak on malign foreign funding of political parties. So very exciting. Over to you, Josh.
Well, thank you, Victoria, for having me. I'm already learning so much here from Brad and Jess. This brings me back to the days when Jess and I worked together at the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy, where we made a point of doing this, of tracking the full toolkit of foreign interference and researching how to close loopholes. And my responsibility at the think tank was to follow what we called covert foreign money, financial flows deployed to influence the democratic processes of sovereign countries. That's what we'll be talking about today. Examples include, loans from banks controlled by Putin's cronies to Marine Le Pen's political party in France, oil profits arranged by top officials in Moscow to benefit Matteo Salvini's party in Italy, material support from the Kremlin to a AfD party lawmaker in Germany, large donations from elite Russian expats in London to the Tory party in the UK, and of course, money and other things of value provided by proxies of the Kremlin or other authoritarian regimes aiming to influence recent US elections, which has been documented in the Mueller report and assessments by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. All of those cases that they demonstrate the overlap between the issues of, on the one hand, foreign political financing, and on the other hand, corruption. Because none of those donations come in the form of checks, cut directly from the Russian Federation or any other government. They come from deniable and hidden proxies who are bankrolled with the proceeds of grand corruption and kleptocracy. Because Putin's oligarchs and cronies, they don't just buy yachts and mansions and jets, they also secretly fund political donations meant to violate sovereignty and undermine democracy. This has become a tool of choice for autocrats aiming to advance illiberal influences in democracies. And so based on that think tank research on covert foreign money, we have data that this has become particularly frequent since the middle of the last decade, when Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014, and then just within a year of there, Xi Jinping came to power in Beijing and elevated United Front work. So since that time, the frequency of these financial attacks jumped from just 2 to 3 per year to the current rate of 15 to 30 annually since 2016. But this tactic, covert funding of political parties, could also be seen in leading up to the past decade. In 1996, the People's Republic of China, PRC, used its embassy in Washington, D.C., as we all know, to plan political contributions to the Democratic Party, including some through donors tied to PRC intelligence services. And for almost as long as Putin has been in power, he has tried to control Kyiv by funding pro-Russian political parties in Ukraine. And we should spend a minute here recounting that case, because it both clearly illustrates the anatomy of a typical financial threat that we're talking about, and as Kristen framed at the top, it's also very relevant to Putin's decision to launch this unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country. Because it might be natural at this moment to see Russia's premeditated and brutal attack on Ukraine as evidence that it's still all about military power, and that is, of course, where the fight is today. But the difficulties that Russian forces are facing in Ukraine at the moment, in addition to being clearly exacerbated by corruption within the Russian military and intelligence services, the challenges may also reinforce Putin's preference to dominate countries through his more common approach of secretly funding political parties. As President Biden said, Putin is after empire by any means necessary, including corruption and coercion. And so this unjustified invasion is just Putin's last-ditch effort to subjugate Kyiv after the Ukrainian people and their elected representatives put an end to his unjustified financial machinations. So to review that backstory, it started in 2004 when Putin reportedly arranged for Gazprom to enrich corrupt intermediaries such as Dmitry Firtash, the oligarch who, together with $10 billion in loans from bankers close to Putin, reportedly funded the 2010 election bid of pro-Russian Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. Fast forward 9 years later, another election, this one won by Volodymyr Zelensky. By that time, Putin's corrupt gas enterprise in Ukraine was diminished, and the pro-Russian candidate that it funded in the 2019 election got less than 12% of the vote. And beyond political parties per se, Russia also reportedly, used corruption to fund pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass, pay for online disinformation in Ukraine, and to control more than half of Ukrainian television news stations through oligarchs such as Viktor Medvedchuk, who's Putin's top proxy in Ukraine, who also was enriched by sweetheart deals from Moscow. Importantly, just 1 year ago, on February 2nd, 2021, Zelensky sanctioned Medvedchuk and took down his pro-Russian television news channels. And within just days of that action, the Russian military started building up around Ukraine as an alternative means to subvert its sovereignty, now that funding political parties or the proceeds of corruption had become less effective. So political financing is and will remain likely the Kremlin's preferred weapon in Ukraine and elsewhere. And so too must it feature prominently in the US government strategies to fight corruption and advance freedom and development. And that's why it's so significant to see how the US government and its allies see this threat and are taking steps to tackle it with a new seriousness. Because around the world, we've seen how illicit foreign political finance threatens the integrity of elections. It gives us certain political actors unfair advantage, creating an uneven playing field, undermining elections as mechanisms to hold officials accountable. It's also it means that women in marginalized populations have an even harder time to compete for elected positions. They already face greater barriers in raising campaign funds, and even without foreign interference to support illiberal candidates, and that just distorts electoral representation and reduces inclusiveness of elections. And more broadly, these tactics that erode confidence and trust in the electoral process, state institutions, democratic values, and especially in the context where there's a lack of control over campaign finance reporting and rules are not enforced. So those are all reasons why President Biden established the fight against corruption as a core U.S. national security interest. And that's why USAID established the anti-corruption task force that I serve on, which is meant to elevate, strengthen, and integrate anti-corruption work throughout the whole agency. One of our responsibilities on the task force is implementing the first ever U.S. strategy on countering corruption, which the administration released in December, and USAID was quite active in developing. And that strategy, it outlines a whole of government approach to elevating corruption, and it highlights the issues that we're talking about today: illiberal actors, authoritarian regimes, and their proxies weaponizing transnational corruption to advance their strategic goals, including by influencing elections and policies in democratic states. So our USAID anti-corruption task force is meeting those threats by expanding our programming with a whole suite of bold new anti-corruption programs announced at the first Summit for Democracy and guided by the US strategy. Secondly, intensifying support to the 51 countries that made related commitments at the summit and are poised to make more commitments this year. And thirdly, lending solidarity to anti-corruption champions, the civil society, government actors, by investing in coalition building and collective action across borders, silos, and sectors, because corruption-funded foreign political financing operates through transnational networks, and so too does it take networks to fight networks. I should also say that these new programs, tools, resources, and urgency that the task force is bringing to these issues stands on the shoulders of 3 decades of bilateral support that USAID has provided to countries that want to promote democracy and good governance, including working with actors across any given country's whole system of political finance. And I would point to 4 actors in particular that USAID supports within a given country: legislatures, administrative bodies, civil society, and political parties. So with legislatures, USAID seeks to promote more transparent institutions that deliver accountability and help deter illicit activities. We provide technical assistance on best practices within legislatures on topics like crafting campaign finance rules, supporting training and development around ethics, promoting asset disclosure of public officials, supporting improvements to government oversight. So that's legislatures. Secondly, with election management bodies and other political finance oversight and enforcement authorities, USAID supports increased accountability through development of transparent regulations and tools for monitoring and enforcement. We've done this in Guatemala, in Colombia, supporting electoral tribunals, inspector generals, attorney generals. Thirdly, with civil society actors, USAID supports advocates, supports advocates and monitors and journalists who do the all-important work of revealing schemes of foreign political financing and pushing for change in sometimes dangerous spaces. And then fourth, with political parties, USAID provides technical assistance to help parties address corruption issues in their manifestos, their party management, help bolster parties' capacity and willingness to improve internal financial controls, compliance with political finance rules and regulations. engage with election commissions, help women and youth members of parties understand the impacts of illicit finance, and more. So if all of these activities, these support activities, sound like, probably vitally important, but maybe boring, like technocratic transparency rules and capacity development about, something that maybe as exciting as eating vegetables, that is sort of the point. USAID funded work to build transparent and fair institutions of political finance over time is the polar opposite of malign foreign political financing that's meant to surreptitiously tip the scales in particular democratic processes like elections. And that difference can be seen, and this is the last thing I'll point out, across three crucial distinctions, which we always try to bear in mind at USAID. One is that our spending, as Kristen noted at the top, is transparent, whereas autocratic political financing is secret, operating through obscure proxies. Our programming is openly accounted for with detailed information about our partners and how funds are regularly spent, and that's disclosed and overseen by Congress. Secondly, it's available to all sides of the political spectrum, incumbent, opposition, left, right, whoever wants to participate in democracy, whereas autocratic efforts might involve picking and choosing preferred parties or candidates. USAID and its partners focus on building up a country's institutional capacity to deliver representative, transparent, inclusive democratic processes under the rule of law, free of anyone's political preferences. Thirdly, and finally, our foreign aid is welcomed and voluntarily accepted by the peoples of countries where we work, as opposed to autocratic violations of sovereignty that cut against people's will. Some leaders who are ambivalent about democracy might be not so enthused about this type of programming, might even welcome an electoral boost from foreign actors, but the citizens of those countries and the laws that protect them overwhelmingly affirm our transparent institution building, foreign aid, and reject malign foreign political financing. And so those three values developed and became solid norms over the past 3 decades. And I would say that, just as USAID's deep bench of technical expertise around democracy promotion is foundational, so too is our commitment to working transparently together with willing partners to build the institutional resilience of democracies, both to safeguard against the threat of foreign covert financing and to be more responsive to democratic constituents. And we see sustaining those values as essential to the integrity and effectiveness of our assistance. So thank you for listening. Apologies for going a couple minutes over time, and looking forward to a discussion.
No apology necessary. Thank you, Josh. I see some questions coming in the chat, but I have one to maybe kick us off. And it's to Jessica, but I think it could also be framed to both Brad and Josh as well. But Jessica, you mentioned a variety of bad practices on regulation that had been used and then exploited as a way to combat disinformation. But I'm curious what practices or legislation that you think that you'd like to see more of. And to kind of follow up, and this is the question that I'd also like to pose to Brad and Josh, is, do you think that this kind of legislation can even be scalable, or do you think interventions need to be totally homegrown?
Sure, happy to take that question, and then I'll be curious how Josh and Bradley, the direction they take it. I would say, as I mentioned, that I think making transparency the norm is should be the pole star, or like the guiding, force behind legislation. So, like the Platform Transparency Act that I mentioned, I think, does several important things. It really, there are platforms have genuine concerns about sharing information with researchers and journalists. There are privacy concerns. They have certain obligations. And I think, this is a really useful model because it took a thoughtful approach to squaring that circle. So, in order to access platform data, you have to be a qualified researcher, and the National Science Foundation will determine who, what constitutes a qualified researcher. But we could imagine, folks with university affiliations, for example, would be kind of widely understood to fall under the sort of under this umbrella. And there's some pushback that it doesn't include journalists. And I think the drafters of the legislation would say we would love to include journalists, but who is a journalist? What qualifies as a journalist? It's really hard to say. And so they've really scoped it narrowly here in order to make it something that the platforms can agree to and that we can kind of let's start here. Importantly, it creates all kinds of protections around the data, because actually, privacy is also a democratic value, and it's incredibly important that platform data, which is our data, it's information about us and the people we communicate with, isn't just sort of widely shared. And so, the idea was to create specific places where researchers could come to access the data, basically like a Library of Congress, like a kind of like a SCIF for platform data, where they could come access the data, do the research that they need to do, but they don't ever take the data. They don't put it on their servers. Their institutions don't get to have a copy of the data. And I think that was really a sort of important privacy protecting innovation that was built in. And then, as you may know, in the United States, it's not legal to scrape content even from publicly available websites. It sort of violates the terms of service of these various platforms, and therefore, there can be sort of consequences for doing so. And this has a chilling effect on research. And it's sort of silly because when we're talking about publicly available information, what we're really saying is that a human being could take many, many hours and log it themselves, but they just can't use a computer to collect the same information that's already out there in the public. So I think there are in ways that enable then like sort of a broader research agenda that can really contribute to public understanding about the kinds of interventions, for example, platforms are putting in place, how they're working, what are their downstream effects, positive and negative. So I think, creating that kind of immunity for researchers who are doing work clearly in the public good, or in the public interest, is also, I think, an important way of removing that chilling effect on researchers who frankly do scrape publicly available information on a regular basis, but might be worried about doing it. So those are a couple of like policy ideas that I think are gaining some purchase here in the United States that, if they were implemented, I think really could, reshape the way that platform research is done. And let me just say, like, it's not just like, we can't have accountability without transparency, and we can't, it's sort of the baseline. It's the first line of like response, because I don't know what to ask the platforms to do if I can't evaluate the effects of different interventions. And so this is kind of like the step that begets future steps.
Yeah, that's a great point. Josh, what about you? In the context of political party financing, you spoke about values and how translatable values can be, but from a position of interventions and policy, what do you think it needs? Do you think that there's scalable solutions, or how do you balance the scalability versus kind of organic homegrown interventions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are scalable solutions that different democracies are implementing and learning from each other and sharing information, and in some cases actually coordinating on. I would point to two different areas. So one is getting the right legal frameworks, the rules and laws in place, and with that there was a whole slew of commitments at the Summit for Democracy in December. Like I said, 51 countries making commitments, including the United States. And that started with cleaning up at home our financial system, illicit finance. That was the leading pillar in the administration's new strategy on fighting corruption. And it included all kinds of new rules, things that advocates had been calling for decades, around transparency in U.S. shell companies, real estate, other professional enablers, and so that's work that has begun at the Treasury Department, but there's also legislative needs as well, and some of our allies are taking the lead on this. A big UK commitment was to advance their economic crime bill, and that's happening now. but the U.S. Has those needs as well, like the Freedom to Vote Act, which would address dark money in our politics. So that's getting the legal framework in place. And then secondly is accountability, and including targeted accountability focused on the oligarchs and other proxies who are up to the types of activities that we've been talking about, and using the proceeds of corruption to fund it. And so just a week or two ago, the Justice Department launched its klepto capture task force that has already been getting busy and working with partners, including it was disclosed yesterday. The U.S. law enforcement has been sharing information with partners in Europe, and that has led to some of the freezing of these yachts in the past couple of weeks. And yesterday, the G7 plus Australia announced this new multilateral task force. It was originally billed and announced a couple of weeks ago as transatlantic, but it's got the full G7 and Australia, so a really international effort. And the Treasury Department announced 28 specific oligarchs and proxies that they're in particular focused on. So we're definitely scaling that across allies as well.
Yeah, thank you. I see some more coming into the chat, but we are a bit running out of time. So maybe we will take one more, and the others can kind of go into discussion in the breakout groups. Brad, if you want to also kind of address the question on scalability versus individual context. And then the first one that came in was from Kristen. Do you find that the public and borrower countries are aware of the risks of hidden and unsustainable debt, and that it's possible for civil society to mobilize and effectively advocate for reform on this?
Sure, my pleasure. I think on the first question on scalability or on just sort of institutional transplant, I mean, we know that legal frameworks for anything, we can't simply move from country to country. We tried it back in the early 2000s in the law and development movement, and we know it didn't work. But in areas such as opaque debt in particular, because existing frameworks are minimal to nothing, and we do have at least some idea of best practice that needs to be implemented. I do think there is that the general set of recommendations and the developments that we see in terms of, okay, this legal framework, et cetera, and what's proven to be best practice can actually be quite useful. But local context is going to play an enormous role. If we pass legislation here in Cambodia, for example, requiring National Assembly and Senate oversight over borrowing procedures and authorization, it'll look wonderful. But our parliament is entirely, our National Assembly is entirely one party, so it's highly unlikely that they would be willing to ask those questions. So I think it's useful, but it's going to have to, per usual, be focused on local context and local issues. On the question of the public and borrower countries, I think that yes, it is an area where civil society definitely can mobilize effectively. But it's also necessary to say it's not going to be the simplest approach, simply because most folks in most places simply aren't really aware of the nuances of public debt and the problem. Generally, I think the most effective way is to engage in essentially public education along with long-term capacity building and economic journalism is absolutely essential. Because this is simply something that local media often doesn't have. But the easiest way is really to note, okay, what are the egregious cases of opaque debt that have been found? And they're not that hard to find. If you start digging. For example, here we looked at one project that was being funded by Beijing. We look and we get a total of 5 or 6 different documents that have different prices. So do we owe 540 million for this hydropower project, or do we owe 510? So 30 million off the books debt, possibly, and then that adds up over time. But getting people to really ask the question, how much do we owe, and to whom do we owe it? And having an actual case of saying, okay, this is a problem. This is something that could have clear impacts. But then also making clear what those impacts are. And then most folks, if you tell them, well, you're going to default on your debt, or your debt to GDP ratio is, I mean, they're going to glaze over and have no idea. But when you look into saying, okay, the real outcome here is you're going to be in a situation where the government isn't going to be able to subsidize X. The government is not going to be able to continue with social welfare spending at a certain level. The government is going to have to cut allocations in other areas simply because what we have to pay back is so large. And making those as real world as possible to sort of move people beyond the oh gosh, this is monetary, this is technical, into yeah, this will affect you, this will affect your family, and it's real.
Thank you, Brad. And we actually have one more excellent question from Jorge to Josh. So thinking of Jessica's point about how to angle a legislative effort, in political financing, would you suggest addressing foreign interference grounding a legislative effort in different existing piece of existing legislation, say elections, lobbying, etc., or rather attempt at one single framework? Example is the Australian Foreign Influence Scheme. What are your thoughts on that, Josh?
It is not a coincidence that Jess and I may be using some similar language around this, around legislative efforts, because the two of us actually co-authored a piece of think tank research called Spies and Money, Legal Defenses Against Foreign Interference in Political Campaigns, that actually talked about that Australian effort and kind of compared that to potential gaps that we saw. Again, that was from the think tank work and perspective, and dividing that around between counterintelligence recommendations and campaign finance recommendations. And some of those, involved, campaign finance legislation. So that part of the legal system, FICA is the name of the statute. Some of it involved FARA, and some of it involved provisions that are wrapped up together in more of a holistic package. A lot of elements of the Freedom to Vote Act, and there are also new ideas out there that are more akin to the Australian effort to criminalize participation in foreign interference, and some of those could either be rolled into existing statutes or entirely new laws. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of different new, and existing things that could be packaged or seen in different lights. But again, all of that's not like as a U.S. government position, but that was kind of some research that's out there that we worked on at Think Tank Land.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. Well, thank you to Jessica, Josh, and Brad for an excellent discussion and for framing this next session for us. That was excellent. We're now going to move into 3 individual group sessions where we're really hoping to learn examples from all of the participants on ways that that you all have seen transparency working to combat illiberal influences under these 3 different frames that we've discussed. Just as a quick note, only the debt and parties topics will be in breakout rooms. If you're interested in discussing information operations, stay in this session. And if you also require translation, the information operations session is the only one that will have translation. The other 2 breakout rooms will be conducted in English. So at this time, we will now be, you can self-select, I believe, which breakout topic you're most curious to participate in. And we're really excited to move into some stimulating conversation from everyone in this session right now. So Hunter, if you can, break us up. Thank you. And again, if you're still in this room, that means that you are going to be a part of the information operations discussion. If you would prefer to be in another room, the political parties or debt, just write to us in the chat and we will assign you to the right room. All right. Georgi, over to you to get us started.
Great, thank you, Victoria. It's a great pleasure for me to lead the session about legislative measures to promote transparency in the information ecosystem. Well, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to National Democratic Institute and Open Government Partnership for organizing this very interesting event, and we listened to brilliant presentations, and I also would like to express my gratitude to the presenters, Jessica, Bradley, and Josh. It was very interesting, and I myself learned a lot from your presentations. Well, actually, we are currently in quite an extraordinary situation due to COVID, but we also forgot about the COVID, and we are facing a terrible aggression of Russia towards Ukraine. And I want to start with the words supporting Ukraine, glory to Ukraine and glory to heroes. This is what Ukraine really needs now. And I think that the topics that we are raised in the presentations and the general topics of today's event is very relevant to what is happening today, because especially the information warfare and what the aggressive countries are using information for, and how we should face and counter this information warfare is really important to discuss. I'm Georgi Gliashvili, Executive Director of the Institute for Development of Freedom of Information. This is the Georgia, Tbilisi-based non-governmental organization who work as in Georgia, but also regionally and locally, and regionally and globally on the various issues, and we are involved in lots of work related to disinformation. So we have a long history of working on promoting transparency, freedom of information, good governance, and the open governance, of course. And we are much involved in the various activities related to disinformation and propaganda. We work with the Parliament of Georgia. We are supporting the Georgia strategic goals regarding the integration with NATO and European Union. And so we work on the increasing transparency and accountability of the legislation, of the legislative branch of Georgia. I would like to stress that various documents reflect and mention disinformation and propaganda as the highest threat for security of Georgia, and not only. Russia's malicious information operations mainly aim to subvert the Georgian state and nullify its Euro-Atlantic hopes. And the same was with Ukraine, and we see quite well what it leads towards. And now we have the direct aggression from Russian state towards Ukraine because of these Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Unfortunately, we are seeing all this, and what the Russia is conducting in Ukraine is really horrible. There are constant messages in media and internet sources that the West has left Ukraine alone, and sanctions imposed on Russia don't have real effect. This is what the Russian propaganda is broadcasting. Trends of illiberal influences in Georgia are distinguished by several factors. Our country is highly vulnerable to Russian influence, and not only Georgia, but those of the former Soviet republics, especially. I mean, the region we are living. Illiberal propaganda is strongly influenced by Soviet and post-Soviet history. These information narratives often build up the far-right rhetoric and instrumentalize emotions and fears. Some of the openly pro-Russian political parties own media holdings and support propaganda of openly false narrative. It's really worryingly that coordination between government and the non-governmental sector is really not on the desirable level. I would say it's minimal due to an underlying mistrust. While non-state actors represent a community of values driven by the same purpose, they do not believe the political officials share those values or especially act upon them. Among civil society organizations, there is a perception that the government's internal horizontal coordination mechanisms are weakly attuned to the external disinformation threat, a finding that seems to be corroborated by the desk research as well. Georgia is a parliamentary republic, and therefore Parliament should play the key role in coordinating the fight against illiberal influences. And at the same time, in this process, Parliament does not have a standalone function. Of course, there should be civil society that should be working with the Parliament to counter the foreign influences. And of course, there are other major players like government institutions who should be quite actively involved in the process. Parliament of Georgia has several working councils where the civil society comprise the consultative groups of the councils. I can underline the importance of the Parliamentary Council on Open Governance, which develops open governance partnership action plans at the Parliament level. We quite actively want to initiate commitments to promote transparency in the information ecosystem to counter the foreign illiberal influences as part of the OGP action plan. This will make implementation of such commitments as multilateral obligations with different political parties and different stakeholders, among them civil society organizations, will be involved. I'm sharing the Georgian experience how to counter propaganda on the legislative levels, and I want to give you one particular example that in 2019, in February 2019, a multi-party thematic inquiry group on the disinformation and propaganda was established in the Parliament of Georgia, and the goal of the thematic inquiry group was to counter the foreign propaganda, and it's crucial for the country to develop unified strategy and the action plan. This was one of the major recommendations that was drafted as the work of the inquiry group. The second one was the state security services should declare the fighting against foreign propaganda as one of the priority directions. The high-ranking officials should be more actively and publicly involved against disinformation campaigns, and media broadcasters, especially the state broadcasters, should be actively involved in the combating the disinformation and foreign propaganda. Unfortunately, there were quite complicated developments after 2019, especially due to the COVID-19, and not much from these recommendations have been implemented, but these recommendations stay as one of the most important in this area. And I can say that based on this report and the thematic inquiry group, the government of Georgia elaborated a draft version of the national security concept, which probably will be adopted by the Parliament in 2022. So this concept covers the implementation of the preventive measures in fighting disinformation and foreign propaganda. So not to take much of your time and give the floor for the discussion, it should be highlighted that transparency also of one of the major issues of the beneficial ownership is a key instrument in identifying the source of funding for illiberal propaganda, and this must be taken into consideration. I especially took this topic as one of the issues to discuss today, especially due to the sanctions that were presented by the Western states towards Russia after it started aggression towards Ukraine. So it's worth mentioning that Russian-Ukraine war should be the importance of transparency, or show the importance of transparency of beneficial ownership very clearly, and the current political regime in Russia will be prosecuted for war crimes. It will increase the cases of money laundering worldwide, which eventually will lead to additional funding for illiberal media and political parties. So having said that, it would be interesting to find out your ideas. Please share examples, your thoughts from different countries about the lessons and challenges of effective legislative commitments related to transparency and oversight of media ownership, political advertising, and press freedom. So the floor is open. Then please, anyone who would be willing to share thoughts, opinions, or giving comments, floor is yours. Starting with, I would be happy to continue just giving different examples from different countries, but in case you could give some thought from your side, I can give you a question like, have you seen parliaments develop transparency-related policy reforms or conduct oversight of this issue? What worked and what did not? Please provide examples that you have seen or you would like to share with us. If we don't have any particular opinions, I can start with several examples from the Western and neighboring countries. Actually, the legislative mechanisms that extend existing rules of information or campaigning to the online environment are noteworthy. This is the case, for instance, in Germany, where the state requires social media companies to develop broadly defined, manifestly illegal content within 24 hours and 7 days period. Otherwise, the regulations imposes high fines on tech companies. Thus, in the case of Germany, the existing regulations on hate speech and other unlawful conduct calls for violence, slander, distribution of personal footage, etc. Have been adopted to the digital space, and the enforcement mechanisms have been imposed on social media companies. Such a mechanism is primarily defined by the presence of tech companies in the country with physical infrastructure to enable litigation to take place in court. So the number of registered users within the state and the degree of judicial independence in the country. However, in this case, the increased responsibility of tech companies covers the privilege of judging content of the information disseminated online. So more dangerous in the trend when regulations similar to the German model have been adopted by the other countries with considerable lower rates and standards of freedom and democracy, and pointing to the potential threats to the freedom of speech and expression. So this shows that the level of democracy where such kind of regulations appear should be quite high to avoid other threats that I have mentioned. So the French Constitution Court rejected such a regulation in 2020 and cited the threat of establishment of conservative standards of filtering information in online spaces. So we see that there are different approaches. A law passed in Turkey in October 2020, which obliges social media companies with more than 1 million users to store consumer data in the country and to place an official representation that will allow local governing actors to block information of so-called degrading content in particularly is particularly problematic. Through this regulation, significant threats were posed not only to the companies facing high fines and restrictions, but also the general standards of freedom of expression. The regulation followed the announcement of the Turkish president that declared social media immoral, which is ought to be controlled or blocked. Several large tech companies, such as Facebook, refused to comply with the regulation and in response received high fines from the President Erdogan's government. It should be noted that the regulation adopted in Turkey sets an important example of the implementation of censorship in the online sphere. There is also the case of the United Kingdom. The government actors described online harm as an activity in the digital space that could harm a person physically or emotionally. This also includes information disseminated or sent personally online. The British regulatory framework legally requires tech companies to protect its customers and appoints an independent regulator to oversee the process. In other words, the regulatory document is based on the one hand on creating a secure digital environment and ensuring freedom of speech and expression on the other. The independent regulators oversees the enforcement mechanism and in the imposition of fines. In addition, tech companies will be required by the regulator to provide detailed information about the logic of the operation and to facilitate the sharing of data with researchers. However, the regulator will not be responsible for the determining the accuracy of the information disseminated online. In addition to social media, the British mechanism also includes public discussion forums, search and communication services. This mechanism is also based on the European Union's e-commerce directive. Thus, in a consolidated democracy, discussions about filtering and reviewing information disseminated online is more conceivable in the light of an independent judiciary system and self-governing regulators. However, in countries like Georgia or countries with the transforming democracies where the discussion still concerns weak state institutions and a low degree of judicial independence, a state regulation is seen as a direct threat to freedom of speech and expression. I can also share the Georgian case in 2020. Law on Georgian electronic communication was amended, followed by the sharp criticism of local and international actors. The amended law of Georgia on electronic communications, proposed by the National Communications Regulator, was approved in July, sparking criticism from civil society actors and media representatives because it empowered the regulator to plant special managers in private companies in particular cases. There were continued concern during the year of interference in the work of the broadcasters and efforts to influence media content. In early July, the National Communications Commission, the telecoms regulator, drafted amendments to the law on electronic communications that were submitted by the government of Georgia to the parliament. The proposed changes could allow the commission to interfere in the media companies' administrative and financial affairs, as well as freedom of expression through the appointment so-called special managers. The draft amendments were reviewed and a week after and approved just already in July 17th with minimal involvement by stakeholders and interested parties, although massive succeeded in watering them down somewhat. Since the Commission had not specified the need for such changes early in 2019 annual report, watchdog group like ourselves attributed them to narrow political aims and raised concern about the further attempts to interfere with the production of media content. So these are just several examples from the global perspective, and I would like to hear now your opinions, either from your experience or just what was presented as an example from my side. As I see, not many questions so far. Probably we can also speak about the open government commitments related to this topic. Actually, have you seen any OGP commitment that address this issue, or if so, have they been effective, or what types of OGP commitments could be put in place? Maybe this could be the topic that we can discuss like more in detail. Well, actually, as we still don't have any comments or opinions expressed, I can share my thoughts about these issues. Actually, the global research conducted by NDI has shown that impact of illiberal influences can be offset by resilient democratic institutions, while levels and types of resilience can vary widely. The role of transparency is particularly critical in enabling greater scrutiny and diminishing space for suspicion and doubt to be exploited by disinformation. Generally, OGP recommends to develop or reinforce legal frameworks that protect the rights of activists, journalists, and independent media. I can go further, but maybe Joe, if he's with us, can also share his thoughts about the OGP role in supporting this topic. Joe, are you with us? Yeah, I think Joe is not presented, so I'll continue. I'll continue just sharing the experience that we have found interesting. Actually, establishing gender-sensitive, responsive protocols is included in this, and the creating mechanisms that allow for independent and public-funded media platforms and avoid concentration of media ownership, challenging or introducing amendments to draconian laws and that may stifle a citizen right to dissent. In case of Mongolia, country has committed to strengthen legal guarantees of the freedoms of the press and expression by inserting a provision that secure the right of a reporter to protect source anonymity in the law of whistleblower, legal status, and the federal freedom of the press law, and aligning this legislation with the spirit of Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Another direction of OGP is to tackle disinformation and strengthen access to information frameworks with legal safeguards against rollbacks during times of crisis. State agencies should refrain from conducting propaganda campaigns and promote legal safeguards to protect the space for independent media and civil society to monitor and flag state-led disinformation campaigns. For instance, Canada's Healthy Democracy Commitment focused on media freedom and democratic strengthening. It championed international norms that support diversity of content and quality and transparency of information. Milestones also included the support of healthy and reliable news ecosystem in the country. As media development and open government research by Paul Rothman suggests for the media development community, the significance of the OGP membership is that it represents an important subset of reform-minded countries, with many expressing the will for reform. The OGP platform provides a unique space for structured multi-stakeholder dialogue, provides spaces and tools for the collaboration, and creates incentives for sustained engagement that could be valuable assets for media reforms. To be sure, the OGP process not always been successful in tackling the most difficult governance problems. Corruption, public finance reform, and public service reforms, for example, require far-reaching changes in the status quo and compromises by key stakeholders. Such deep-seated governance challenges do not always respond to the structured approach of goal setting and multi-stakeholder dialogue that OGP provides. And absent the necessary political will by governments and main decision makers and sustained engagement by civil society by OGP is no more likely to provide a silver bullet for the complex area of media sector. Yet many studies of media development have concluded that a more integrated, politically engaged approach to media reform is needed, while other studies show that successful reforms have almost always required the multi-stakeholder dialogue and agenda setting. Unfortunately, OGP commitments of my country, Georgia, do not reflect the importance of countering the illiberal influence, but there is the forum, and civil society organizations are quite active in promoting various reforms in the frames of the OGP, and we plan to advocate this issue further and promote commitments and advocate for the commitments to supporting the unified approach of civil society and state actors in fighting the foreign propaganda, ensuring transparency in the information ecosystem, especially during the developing situation in our neighborhood, the aggressive war of Russia in Ukraine, and considering those of the threats that Georgia has from its northern neighbor Russia, which which is using, as I have mentioned many times, propaganda and disinformation to threat Georgia's Euro and Euro-Atlantic aspirations. That is why it will be important to now to hear like experience from your countries, your particular experience while working on these issues, and we can all learn something from our session. So please share your thoughts, your opinions, give examples, counter me in case you find anything that I have mentioned that can be understood differently. So please provide your thoughts and opinions to have a not my presentation, but discussion on this topic.
Hello, my name is James. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, very well, please.
Yeah, I'm from Taiwan, and I think the most challenging, not only the Russian, but also the China. So I want to have some experience to share about influence operation and disinformation influenced by China to Taiwan. Okay. Authoritarian countries will influence public opinion and politics in democratic countries through influence operation and disinformation. We have some research shows that China, there are the worst two major authoritarian regime. One is Russian, have different ways to manipulate information. Like Russia focus on quality. For example, during the 2006 US presidential election, and in our experience in Taiwan, China used the quantity. China focused on quantity influence Taiwan through a large amount of disinformation. Disinformation from China may not directly affect public opinion in Taiwan, although some people may be influenced in their perception because they are inclined to trust China. These are a minority in Taiwan. However, it should be noted that those within a less suspectable majority could still be disbelieve mainstream information on account of China's disinformation. In oversupplying manipulating information, China is able to achieve its goal not by winning hearts and minds, but by ensuring that the sheer volume of information outlives from distrust, even to a credible source of information. This situation is a major concern for the development of democracy in Taiwan. This is my experience and my opinion to share.
Thank you very much, James. Actually, we have others also who would like to express their opinions. Yulia Timoshik, please, floor is yours. I think Yulia is not with us anymore. I think colleagues from NDI wanted to speak. Slobodan and Kelly. Yulia has some connections issues and she will be joining soon. Maybe anyone else who would like to speak? We can actually continue by thinking about the ways how to avoid disinformation, how to counter disinformation. a general question, actually, is transparency the answer? What else we can take as a measure against the disinformation? This is also one of the topics that can be discussed. We have comment from Jonathan, actually. Thinks that often the purpose of disinformation is to create an overall sense of distrust. Illiberalism benefits from the sense that nothing is true. That's correct. Yulia, are you back with us?
May I add a comment?
Oh, yes, sure. Yes, sure. Božena.
I'm Božena Jelušić I'm MP from Montenegro, chair of Gender Equality Committee, and a teacher who introduced media literacy in educational system in Montenegro as an optional subject in gymnasia. So I do think that maybe that subject could be addressed even to not only for the media organization of self and regulatory organization, but even to the educational system. And I think that the fact checker, we have here in Montenegro a lot of NGO organizations who are doing fact checking on the field and trying to debunk the information coming abroad to Montenegro, who is somehow under the influence of disinformation even from Russia. So it is a way to teach people, I think, to teach young people on the first side how to check who is writing it, who is delivering the information, how to make a sort of debunking information. So that's maybe on a long stick answer, but it is still an answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Božena. It's really interesting. Actually, we had another comment from on the case of Mongolia from Engsestek Dagwa. The digital literacy fact-checking initiatives are also important. Unfortunately, this requires substantial resources, and governments and are often not willing to invest in such initiatives. Yeah, that's quite true, actually. Not governments sometimes are not taking it seriously to the threat that this misinformation might have, and quite frequently civil society. I can speak about the country example of Georgia, that civil society is more active in advocating for the countering propaganda and misinformation than government or even parliaments taking it seriously. There is also one question from Hunter, actually. There is one question that also can be raised, actually, in thinking of how should countries be thinking through responses from CCP sponsored disinformation or Kremlin sponsored disinformation, or are the interventions the same? What do you think about these questions? Actually, what's your opinion?
James again. Let me try to answer the question about hunters. In Taiwan, we have a lot of citizen groups in Taiwan are working together to combat the problem of disinformation, which with different tools and methods. They do this primarily by collecting, checking, and clarifying suspect false information. Yes, just like we have said, human and resource constraint make it impossible to investigate all suspected cases of fake news, meaning that only those cases that are particularly serious can be checked. So it's all about human being and resource. So we only can check the most particularly serious things, and not only one citizen groups, but in Taiwan we have many different groups. In Taiwan, we are not use WhatsApp in the most. We use the app called Line. So in the Line, we have many fake news and disinformation come to this app. So many groups of like in Taiwan's organization will use this app to clarify, and then let the CCPs they're working, what they are doing can be less influence Taiwan's peoples. This is what we are doing now in Taiwan.
Thank you, James, for your comment. Actually, yeah, it's quite interesting, your experience. I would like to also hear the other countries' experiences as well. In Georgia, we have the Coalition for the Right Information, which is supported by the USAID program in Georgia. And in the frames of this coalition, which is the Information Integrity Coalition, we are supporting, we collectively and jointly plan and advocate for the various issues related to misinformation, and also provide research as well as the different activities. If the colleagues from the coalition are attending this session, I will be happy to hear from them as well, actually, their opinions about this issue.
I think I might be the only one from coalition today here. Hello to everyone. Yes, the coalition idea was actually to connect these different organizations, different civil society organizations with their own agendas, but with overarching aim to create better informational environment in the country, and combating and creating counter narratives to the foreign influence and foreign malign influence is one of the top priorities of this coalition. The best so far, the results of working with coalition has been that the organizations managed to cooperate, to unite their expertise. Some of the organizations, as some of you also already mentioned, are focused on more fact-checking and monitoring, while others are focused, as is IDFI as well, focused on analysis and providing counter narratives and providing more positive narratives, so to say, about history, which has become Russia's one of the strongest tools to monopolize. We saw in case of Ukraine how Russia reinterpreted Ukrainian history prior to the war and aggression. So yes, these are the issues that the coalition has been working about. And besides its own, collaborative work. Coalition from time to time also is addressing the government with the proposals, and is also trying to, cooperate with the decision-making bodies on the sense on the issues that regard better informational environment. As we know, sometimes civil society organizations are not enough in their capacity to combat foreign malign influence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nino. Actually, we have the comment from Yulia Timoshuk. Dear all, I'll provide a comment. Very basic but practical steps to combat disinformation now in Ukraine on the side of institutions: provide constant updates on official channels, provide official comments if any publicly shared info is a fake, and have more than one official instrument of communication for technical reasons. Thank you very much, Yulia, for your comments. We very much understand the situation in Ukraine. It is completely unbelievable what is happening, but having such an aggressive neighbor as Russia, you should always be prepared for everything. Actually, nobody could even imagine that Russia might take such an aggressive steps and start such a direct and aggressive war against Ukraine, but it happened, and we should counter it with every efforts, including information. So yes, it's very relevant and interesting. There is another question from Doyan. How have you seen OGP help, or how would you like to see OGP work on these issues? Actually, in my intervention, I have spoken about the several good examples of the OGP commitments related to the topic, but I think that OGP is one of the important platforms which can be used for different reforms, including the commitments related to information, and I think this can be used very well. I've already mentioned that we in Georgia plan to use this platform and advocate for improvements in these regards, and advocate government to take certain commitments related to this topic. And I really encourage colleagues from up to 80 countries which are the members of the OGP community, to especially those who face the similar problems or think that the misinformation is a threat to their countries, to take and support the governments in their particular countries and respective countries to use this opportunity, OGP, to take the commitments on these issues. I think we are close to the end of this session, and in case there is any particular comment or opinion that you would like to share or example, once again, this is the final chance before we wrap up. So please, we have just a few minutes left, and if not, actually, I think we can little by little go to end and finalize our session. Thank you then, and I hope that the examples given, the opinions shared can further develop as the recommendation that we will use in further of our work. Thank you very much to all those who participated, who listened, and especially to those who gave their opinions and expressed their thoughts, as well as shared some of the interesting examples. Thank you very much.
All right, y'all, welcome back. Thank you so much. I hope that everyone's breakout discussions were as interesting and fruitful as mine was. Now to kind of pull everything together, we're going to move into our third session. And just as a reminder, after this session, we'll have an optional breakout for networking afterwards, and then just some quick closing remarks. So this next session is with Joe Foti, who is an open government expert at the Open Government Partnership. And he's going to highlight the challenges, opportunities, and ways to make some short and medium-term commitments to combat these issues that we've been discussing today. I'm really excited for this session, and we'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. And thanks to all the experts who have been taking part today. I hope that everyone's heads are full of great ideas about legislation, action, work that can be done to begin closing the gap around countering these influences. And I want to propose this group that OGP should be a central part, at least in the countries where it works, and a model in places where OGP is not operating, for beginning to tackle these issues. And so I am going to show you a slide, because I'm going to show you, as is my way, probably a lot more graphs than you want to see. But for those of you that don't know OGP, it's a 10-year-old multilateral, multi-stakeholder initiative, which means that it has many members, 78 national members and a growing number of subnational members with civil society actors, and that the basic model is that governments co-create action plans with concrete, ambitious commitments in collaboration with civil society. So that I will share my screen. Oops. Victoria, am I allowed to share my screen?
You should be able to. Let me give you permission. Hold on.
No problem. I mean, I'll start, and then if it works, just interrupt me, I guess. So among the 78 members, many of them are on their 4th or 5th action plans, and they are now, we are at almost 5,000 commitments if we include our local subnational members. So we will, let's see, maybe I just share with you my slides also works.
You're now a co-host. Now you're able to. Thanks, Joe. For your
Fantastic. All right. Oops. Wrong one. Correct graph. Okay. So what I'm going to argue is that there's, at the moment in OGP, a fundamental mismatch between the focus of OGP action plans and the need that's been expressed by the experts today. And I would suggest that legislatures can play a very important role in doing this. So here's where OGP action plans are currently focused. And I would have had a very hard time describing this graph to you. But it's, so you can see the biggest topic currently is public service delivery. Fiscal openness is down here on the left, and you can see increasingly topics like inclusion or justice are important, but you'll also see other areas that may be important here, like open contracting and public procurement. We'll get to these in a second. But even though there's this fundamental misalignment or lack of focus right now, at least in terms of these big raw numbers of what's being done in the 78 OGP countries, I think we can see that there's seeds of how to tackle each of these issues with areas that have been extremely popular in OGP. So open contracting and fiscal openness have been by far the two most popular areas that OGP members work on. I think it's not a hard leap to begin engaging related agencies and different governments within OGP on making debt transparent and operating there, building off of the successes they've had in these other areas. On political finance, lobbying, all these influence discussions, we unfortunately do not have as much work on this, and I'll talk about that a bit more, but asset disclosure is actually one of the requirements that governments are supposed to have in place in OGP. Unfortunately, we don't have updated data on that, and we're operating on data from 2015 when we determined their eligibility now. So we're hoping to update that. The third one that I'd say is that we have reasons for hope in countering illegal information operations. And some of this might be in the work that's being done on beneficial ownership and civic space. Some of this will be on emerging digital work. And there's models that have worked where you can see here gender was basically not even a topic within OGP countries. It was in a rounding error. It's now the majority of countries are dealing with gender directly in OGP. And you can see a similar pattern with justice, where it's now almost, it's definitely cooler to have open justice and access to justice commitments in your action plans than not. And these were not popular topics a few years ago. Why did this work? Because the right political actors got in the room with the right civil society organizations, funders lined up, and there's just a growing consensus to where a thing like access to justice, people would say, well, that's not open government a few years ago. Now it's fully within it. So I'd like to say the same thing could be done with what we're talking about now, even though it may not be as popular. So part of the problem we also have is that we don't actually understand political integrity. We don't understand influences. We don't know what policies are in the country. So one of the things we're doing this year with Jorge's team from Transparency International and with the Global Data Barometer, which is based out of the Latin American Institute for Open Data, is trying to map where the laws and policies and actual practices are on these issues. So speaking of influences and persuasion, if you can believe it, there is no global data set on lobbying. We don't have comparable data on asset disclosure or politically exposed persons and other important areas. So we're collecting all of this political integrity data with Global Data Barometer and partners around the world. And I want to give you a sneak preview of some of it and what it suggests for where the work lies ahead in some of these countries. So this is draft data. It should be published by the end of the month, but because you had the initiative and skill set to attend this session, you get to see it early. So what we can see here is on the left in dark blue, you have the laws. So almost every OGP country has a political finance law on the books that requires people to submit, parties, individuals, outside finance, they're supposed to be disclosed. Similarly with asset disclosure. As you can see, is there any data available? And there's a very low bar. Is there any data available? The practice falls far behind the law. In other areas of influence that are important, like lobbying, which you can see towards the right, you can see that lobbying is specifically, many countries just lack laws. They're not even tracking this information, or it's voluntary. There's actually more countries doing it voluntarily than in reality. So when you look at the actual practice, so for example, here's political finance, zooming in at the legal requirements that are in that country, the availability, the usability, you can see that things are much weaker than we would hope. So and specifically, I want to point everyone down to the very bottom line right here, which is, can you download political finance data available for bulk download? This would be how you would actually detect inconsistencies and tie it to other things. That's the problem, is that in a lot of places you have to download PDFs that were turned in, or scans that were turned in by people in various areas. And you cannot, in most OGP countries, and includes many wealthy countries, you cannot download your entire parliament's political finance disclosure documents the way you can in other places. This is one of those slides that we did in the 90s that just makes your eyes hurt, so I apologize. But this is essentially showing you what is the coverage of these laws. And all I hope that people can see is that there's a lot of red, is that there isn't necessarily, I mean, just pick any line. I'll stop talking for a second. You can read it. Unique identifiers for donors. Does it include the first and last name of the donors? Where do they live? So you can see all of these different things. And what you'll see is that the bad news is most of the countries don't require the level of data disclosure that you would want to see in practice, and they don't necessarily require that data disclosure in sorry, they don't actually do it. It's more important. That would allow us to actually see where the influence is coming from. And this includes non-financial support. You can see, what is it down here, second to last line, only 30% of countries collect data on non-financial support, which, as Josh has told us, is extremely important here. We don't have equivalent data on debt or the other one, but I wanted to on debt or information operations, and I'm not sure how we would categorize that at the moment, but we do want to be able to publish this at country by country level, which will allow advocates at the national level to be able to go talk to their governments about which data, which transparency is being carried out in these different areas. So there was an example of what that might look like in Albania for a few areas. I want to shift to parliaments. Parliaments have always been involved in OGP. Some people think it's a new thing, and definitely, as you can see here on the right, more and more parliaments have become involved in OGP action plans over time, but they've actually always been an important part. Now, the good news is when you look at what parliaments are actually focusing on, they're more aligned with what this group is talking about today. They focus on anti-corruption, access to information, fiscal openness, even money in politics, where you do see that in OGP. It's mostly been through legislative action, and that's a really positive thing. So I think legislatures are where the action is at in a lot of OGP countries here, and it seems, based on their revealed preferences, that this is where they want to make commitments in OGP. Now it's important to look at what do we mean by legislatures being involved, and it really means four things in OGP. The first one is taking legislative action. This is by far the most popular, and that's what you saw in that last slide, is most of those were parliaments taking legislative action. The second thing is ensuring parliamentary oversight of the executive, of election processes, of the various, making sure election management boards are carrying out their work properly. This is almost non-existent, is the bad news there. And then opening up parliamentary processes. This has become increasingly popular over time, with parliaments working towards making themselves more popular, Chile being the first big innovator, but by no means the only one. And then the last one is creating space for dialogue and participating in OGP. So just the practical of how that happens, if you're working at the OGP national level or you work with national partners, is currently the main thing that happens is parliaments take part in OGP national action plans. That's the status quo. They may also act outside of the OGP action plan. In Italy and in Canada, they held hearings on the progress of the OGP action plan to see how the executive was carrying it out and whether it was in compliance with the law. And finally, they can create their own standalone action plans, which is relatively new innovation in OGP. How does this work really practically? We looked at political finance. Here's the data on asset disclosure, because most parliaments should be subject to asset disclosure laws. Again, we can see here that the parliaments and appointed officials going again to Josh's presentation, do they collect specific information on in-kind and non-financial support that they're getting, or non-financial things in their politically exposed persons database? Do they report significant changes in assets and liabilities? So let's think about what that means in terms of an OGP action plan. You can see there's a lot of room for improvement. So what would that mean to improve things through an OGP action plan? Is that legislatures could take concrete commitments to, number one, disclose their own assets, whether that's through legislation or by just implementing the law that exists and setting up the institutions to allow them to do that. They can strengthen transparency and disclosure requirements for all of the branches. And similarly, they might strengthen independent oversight mechanisms like electoral management boards who are responsible for monitoring those asset disclosures. We could come up with a similar list, and I hope we do, on hidden debt. Have a little bit of work on that, about what commitments can be undertaken there. And then we can do a similar list on foreign influence operations, information operations, although that one's quite complicated. So I'll have to do some real thinking there on what they can do. But I will stop there and just say it's been done before. We're not starting from zero, but no one's going to be unemployed anytime soon, as long as everyone stays interested in this. There's plenty of work to do.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I really appreciated that presentation. I'd like to open it up for any questions. We have about 10 minutes if folks have any questions coming out of, the breakout groups. I know in my breakout group, we didn't specifically talk about OGP commitments and how we can be utilizing OGP specifically in the political party financing perspective in particular, but I'm curious if others who were in either the information operations breakout group or the debt group might have some specific questions. Let's see, we have a quick message from, a question from Kevin. Have you connected with the Summit for Democracy to help weave these into commitments? Great question.
Yeah, our hope this year is that we're working very closely with Brookings and some folks at State Department. We've built a database of the Summit for Democracy commitments, which we published, I think, on the Brookings website and our website last week. I can drop the link in when I'm done talking. And we've tracked which of them are relevant to open government partnership and which of them are relevant to different topics that are here. For us, then to be relevant to us, they have to tick a box of transparency, civic participation, or public accountability. So however laudable some of the commitments may be, they might not be relevant. So we have that database ready. Our hope over the next year is that any OGP members who are able to, any OGP members move their Summit for Democracy commitments into their OGP action plans, because OGP has a much stronger independent reporting mechanism and much stronger accountability processes and public oversight than the Summit for Democracy does, which is much more informal and state to state, as you've seen. So our thought is that building that redundancy will strengthen both Summit for Democracy and OGP.
All right, we have a hand raised. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm connecting from Mongolia. I hope you can hear me. All right, it's actually quite late here. I agree with the data presented, and Mongolia is certainly actually a case that fits in that picture where we have good disclosure laws, but when it comes to implementation, it's really quite a bad picture. But a lot of it also has to do with the capacity and knowledge, existing knowledge in the country when it comes to government, also civil society. For instance, this week there is a lot of debate about open data and requirements for data, etc. But there is not much consistency when it comes to like what constitutes open data, especially when it comes to political party finance, etc. Because there is obviously very real interest on the part of political parties and other political actors to keep certain data hidden, right? So this is where I hope the OGP comes into picture, because we've been part of OGP and civil society in Mongolia in my organization, Open Society Forum is has been very active in formulating the National Action Plan, etc. But like when we need like real support, when times like this, you know, when we need to come up with like standards for instance, beneficial ownership, political finance data, like what do you mean by structured data, etc. There really is not much support from OGP. So I hope you can take that into consideration when you move forward. And I know that independent reporting mechanism is very effective when it comes to measuring success, etc. But like in Mongolia's case, we do really fail when it comes to that part. And the reason why is that like in the middle of in between the in-between period, like now when you have submitted our national action plan and we have to implement it, there is not a lot of support come from OGP. So I'm just hoping that you might take that into consideration. So it's not more, not much of a question. It's rather a request for assistance and probably an area of collaboration.
I think that's, yeah, I hear you. And two things that I hope are helpful is we will be having a permanent full-time legislative staff person starting on who's quite a senior person. And so when it comes to legislative assistance, they may be able to help. Also, we'll have country by country reporting, which will include Mongolia, on what the scope and what we did with colleagues around the world with different organizations is we tried to help. OGP is not a standard setting organization, as you know, but we tried to develop an understanding of what the scope and content of these high value political data sets should be to improve political integrity. So I hope that we'll be able to give you a report that's specific enough for Mongolia and that has examples from other countries that may have better systems in some ways than Mongolia. And you can say, okay, you have to include in-kind donations, which includes trips and includes, you know, like, and that should be disclosed in structured data. And then we can connect you with further people. But I hear you, and I can, of course, I am happy to forward on any questions to colleagues who might be able to help you more with those specific things.
Thanks.
Joe, you know, I think the question of this question on best practices and shared learnings, you know, I think that's one that I get a lot whenever it comes to support to parliaments who are looking to engage in the OGP process and the executive as well. You know, I'm curious also if there's any upcoming events or, you know, ways that you think whenever we're looking at this topic in particular, thank you for sharing your email, flag that in the comments for everyone. As we're looking at this topic in particular, and, you know, a big kind of goal of this topic is and for NDI's kind of foray into this topic is to be sharing best practices and lessons learned. And I'm curious if there are any upcoming events or places where the folks who are on this call can be plugging in and learning more, and if, from other people's experiences or from OGP's experiences that you'd also want to highlight at this time.
Yeah, I think we have different work. You know, I'd like to first off continue discussion with everyone who's on this call some more, and this is really helpful. We will have the political integrity report, which we're co-producing with Transparency International and a number of other, and the Global Data Barometer and all kinds of other organizations have been a part of this huge project to map out this political integrity data. That's going to be out in June. At the same time, particularly in Europe, and I don't know how many folks here are, how heavily we're with the Europe group, is we should have increasing amounts of data on, we should have increasing amounts of information on political advertising transparency, and that was a big project that the Open Government Network for Europe put out last week with the pending passage of the Digital Services Act in the European Union, which will very much affect disclosure around advertising, including outside advertising and platform transparency. And let me think. around debt, we need to probably think a little bit more about what we can do, and to the extent that to the extent that we can start measuring debt transparency and have more and more guidance and standards, it's been really very helpful what Bradley posted, but we need to have a more structured approach to it yet. And so I'd be open to suggestions beyond what we've done so far, which is really good work. I want to give congratulations to NDI doing great work in Georgia to get the Georgian Parliament to begin publishing all these different types of debt. But we're hearing this request from African countries in particular also, just we need to get a handle on this debt, and we don't have a concerted program for it right at the moment, but we'd be open to suggestions. We're thinking about doing a collaboration with Mo Ibrahim Foundation on this particular topic. Does OGP collaborate with the IMF? They're an official partner of OGP, but no, we don't have ongoing programs that collaborate with the IMF the way that we do with World Bank or NDI or other international organizations and institutions.
Thank you for those who are still with us. I see a thumbs up in the chat. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn it back over to Joe to help close us out for any final thoughts that he might have, and just a quick wrap up from Joe.
I see a raised hand from Charles. Do you want to take a quick question, Victoria? We're running out of time.
Yeah, Charles, do you have a quick question, or was that a mistake? Up to you. Okay. Oh, Charles, if you have a question, also put it in the chat, and we can also take it that way too, whichever works best. Over to you, Joe.
Great. So first off, I totally enjoyed that. I'm always skeptical about these things, but I very much enjoyed getting to talk to people. And the last session that I was in with our colleague David from Georgia was really good, because he said, what are we going to do now in Eastern Partnership countries to follow up on this meeting? And so that's the big question, is what can we do to make sure that everyone, like I said, do we have the right ideas? Do we have the right institutions? Do we have the right individuals in the room to make these type of reforms happen? And so I want to thank NDI and all the experts for making this happen. Really looking forward to the policy briefs, which will be coming out soon. You guys can be more specific on that. And then I'd like to be able to make sure these all get into OGP multi-stakeholder forum action planning processes, all those people's hands, to make sure they have all these ideas there together and that we can take these forward. Like I said, we'll have a reinvigorated parliaments program, and it will be great to see how these two streams of work can come together at a practical level on a country by country basis. But thank you again for everyone for participating.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks to OGP for joining us in this effort and in this discussion today. And thank you to all the experts, and thank you to everyone here for your time and your thoughtful consideration. As Joe mentioned, we have these upcoming policy briefs that we're going to be very excited to share with you all. So if you opted yes when you registered for email correspondence, we'll share it with you. Available, and we'd love your feedback. But hopefully, the intention is for the expert discussion that was that happened today to be reflected in those policy briefs. But and thank you to AGORA for allowing us to use this as a venue for this discussion. I believe there are probably going to be future iterations of community of practice meetings in the future, and so keep an eye out for those when those times come. So thank you all. This was really timely, and we really appreciate your time and the events that are occurring right now in the world, and we really think that this could not have come at a better moment in time. So thank you, and we will all be in touch. Good evening, good night, and good day.